human rights initiatives, and redirect our tax dollars into healthcare, education, green jobs, and other life-affirming programs. So, right as we start this webinar, you might be aware that the United States has officially withdrawn troops from Afghanistan. And this sets an end to one of the United States, what we call forever wars. And really, as the dust settles and we begin to learn more and more about the actual costs of the United States so-called war on terror that we've engaged in over the past 20 years, the figures that are coming out are really startling. So according to a new study out from our partners at the National Priorities Project, over the past 20 years, the United States has spent more than $21 trillion on militarization by their count. And that includes militarization, surveillance, and repression, all in the name of the so-called war on terror. And of that total, 16 trillion went to the military. So 16 trillion directly to the military, including at least $7.2 trillion for military contractors. Again, really startling, right? $7.2 trillion. I can't even imagine that number. It's so large. And that's what we're here to talk about today, right? Private companies that profit from war. Of course, we know that our politicians' campaigns are funded by these enormous war profiteers. But something that often flies under the radar is the fact that our representatives are themselves personally invested in the companies they enrich when they approve the Pentagon budget every year. Which is why I'm very excited and really honored to have David Moore here today to talk more about this topic. David is the co-founder of Sludge, which is an investigative newsroom focused on money and politics. With co-founder Donald Shaw, he has covered the US Congress for over a decade, including as founders of the former government transparency resource, Open Congress. His most recent story on the stock holdings of members of Congress in the defense industry is a follow-up to one of Sludge's most shared stories titled The Members of Congress Who Profit from War. David lives in Brooklyn, New York. And before I welcome David and invite you to speak, David, just a couple of reminders for everyone on the call. So David will have a chance to present this incredible investigative article that he wrote and some of his important research. Then he and I will just have a short conversation with some follow-up questions, during which time, if you have any questions, you can just type them in the chat box on Zoom. Or if you're watching us on YouTube, you can tap that in the chat box on YouTube. And we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. So really, this is a really exciting opportunity to ask David some really important questions. So I really encourage people to do that. And like I've said before, this webinar is being recorded and live streamed and will be sent to all participants when we're done tonight. So without further ado, welcome, David. I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Carly, and hello to everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate the chance to present this work to you, and I wanted to start off by thanking everyone in their interests in these topics. I think they're often overlooked, and I'm glad that so many people are interested in the conflicts of interest and the ways in which the military budget continues to inflate and be increased by Congress year after year after year. Our nonprofit news website, Sludge, it's a two-person investigative team, and we're focused on money and politics. We've been publishing for about 3 years, and we cover some of the ways that powerful special interests advance their agendas without necessarily needing to disclose them in any sort of convenient or timely way. And the topic of today's webinar, I think, is a great example of that, the investments of members of Congress in Pentagon and military contractors. This is information that's not necessarily easy to obtain. Our new site put it together through a process of some data scraping and manual research, and I'll briefly show what that looks like, to be able to publish the article that's on the front page of our website right now at readsludge.com, an updated look at the US senators and representatives who personally own, their households own stock in some of the top Pentagon contractors, companies whose names you've heard of, like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. I'll briefly start as some background. You might be saying this is screaming conflict of interest, and in many cases, you'd be right. The phrase that jumps to mind when people hear about this is conflict of interest. Isn't this an ethics violation? How is this possible that members of Congress can personally hold millions of dollars in stock in companies whose budgets they largely approve? And the background is that members of Congress are allowed to own stock and securities. They're allowed to hold it even in companies whose industries they oversee. So someone on a defense committee can own stock in weapons makers. Some of the requirements are that they publish the information in annual reports, which come out as PDFs online. And then whenever they trade stocks, which happens frequently, let's just say they conduct a stock transaction, a purchase or a sale, they must report that information within about 45 days. That's not a very timely disclosure window. I'm going to flip on a screen share so that I can show an example of what a disclosure form looks like. So first, this is the article I'll be running down briefly here. It's right here. It's on the homepage of readsludge.com. But this, sharing my screen now, is how a US representative discloses their investments. It can often be in blurry, almost illegible paper forms. This is permissible under House and Senate rules according to the rules of each chamber, and it leads to a real lack of public information in what your elected officials are invested in as they make policy and write federal legislation covering everything, not just the military, but also everything from healthcare policy to the energy industry and the fossil fuel investments and more. But to dial in now on the Pentagon contractors, over the last 20 years, of course, the military budget has skyrocketed with the war in Afghanistan and operations in Pakistan, Iraq, and other countries. Defense analyst Stephen Semler, who publishes a newsletter, found that over the past 20 years, Congress has sent $2 trillion to the top 5 weapons companies. And these are some of the companies in which members of Congress hold investments without a whole lot of timely public disclosure of what they're holding. Sludge's story most recently, coming from just last month, is a follow-up on one of our previous stories, The Members of Congress Who Profit from War, that was published in January 2020 and looked at a previous round of investments. For this story that we're now sharing and discussing, it's a comprehensive look at investments in defense contractors, in the top 100 defense contractors. That's current as of late August when the story was published. This is the first place where you can find these tables here that I'm highlighting here in my screen share. The US senators invested in the defense company stocks with the names of the senators and the stocks that they hold, companies with the names of Raytheon and others, as well as the US House members who hold investments in defense company stocks. You can see the full list here by clicking on those little arrows that are on the box there. Our top line finding was that nearly 4 dozen members of Congress, which includes 11 US senators and at least 36 representatives, hold up to $6.7 million worth of stock in defense contractors. Many of these, as I mentioned, are companies like weapons makers like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon that receive the vast majority of their revenue, at least 80% of their revenue, from defense contracts that are approved by Congress, first through a spending authorization process, and then through an appropriations process where the contracts are signed. These companies also have opportunities to obtain federal dollars through Homeland Security contracts and energy contracts as well, which means that there's multiple opportunities for representatives on many committees to be able to allocate, to be able to approve and even appropriate federal dollars to companies in which they are personally invested. I'll briefly mention a couple of the top stockholders, and the full list, of course, are available here. In the U.S. Senate, the 2 top stockholders in defense companies are both Democrats Sheldon Whitehouse and John Hickenlooper, the newly elected Democrat from Colorado. But it's particularly notable that Senator Roy Blunt, the Missouri Republican who will be retiring from Congress next year, is a member of the Defense Subcommittee while his spouse holds up to $250,000 in Lockheed Martin. Senator Blunt has been an outspoken cheerleader for Lockheed Martin's troubled F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program, which has been ballooned in cost to a multiple of its initial estimate and is plagued by delays and issues. In the U.S. House, some Democrats jump to mind jump up in the stock holdings, including Jerry Connolly of Virginia, who represents a district that includes the defense contractor Leidos, and Debbie Dingell, who holds of Michigan, who holds stock in Honeywell. But the top stockholders are a pair of Republicans from Texas. The first is Kevin Hern, with over $1 million. He's actually a chair of a Republican study committee that recommends increasing the defense budget. Shocking, I know the phrase shocking always comes to mind. Representative Kevin Hern is joined in some of the top stock holdings by Representative Michael McCall, who's also invested in Honeywell, a nuclear weapons contractor. You can see the top companies here. And before I sort of pause for a moment to begin looking over at the chat and taking some questions, as well as taking some questions from Carley, I'll note that many of the defense contractors receive significant amounts of money from the Defense Department without much by way of competition. So the defense contracting issue and the way that the military continually increases its budget through lobbying of key committees, it's also a monopoly issue. Researchers have found that almost half of Pentagon contracts are less than competitively awarded. And Pentagon contracts are typically awarded on a cost basis where their overruns are simply paid for out of public funding and out of taxpayer money. The total costs of Pentagon contracting eats up almost half the defense budget every year. And as well, the share has been rising of the amount that's been going to contractors over the last several decades. And these mammoth figures of hundreds of billions of dollars that go to the Pentagon contractors that Congress provides the money to every year, that's even understating the total amount of money that's spent on militaristic and national security responses. There are some links towards the end of my article to more research that where folks can consult and share, which finds that the total national security spending, including other sorts of militaristic spending on law enforcement, totals 1.2 trillion every year, an enormous sum of money that's ballpark the same as the federal discretionary budget, the entire budget for all the agencies that Congress appropriates every year. So I have more figures I can share on individual senators, representatives, trends, and companies. And I'll be happy to pause now and I'll glance over at the questions and invite Carley to jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really great overview, David. I mean, I think most people in the webinar are not shocked at these numbers, but also when you see them in the levels that you're showing us, it is shocking, right? And I mean, you mentioned that over the past 20 years, right, if you're just looking at the beginning of the sort of so-called war on terror, that the share of our Pentagon budget that goes directly to these private companies has increased. That's completely correct. And also we can share some really great research from the Costs of War project, where they show that the commercialization, as they call it, of the Pentagon has increased rapidly since the beginning of the war on terror. So I have a couple of questions, and then I'm going to start getting to some of the great questions in the chat box. But just a couple of things from your article that I think are really important, and I think people from CODEPINK would be really interested to hear more about. You mentioned obviously some of the representatives who are personally invested in these weapons companies. Do you see a sort of a pattern to who owns these types of stocks? Like, do they tend to be on these committees that you mentioned that allocate funding for the Pentagon budget, right? Like we see that CODEPINK looks at campaign contributions from weapons contractors, and we see the chair of the House Armed Services Committee gets significantly more than his colleagues. So is that a pattern that you see?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
In the tables in the article, you can see some of the folks can see some of the relevant caucuses and committee affiliations for the different senators and representatives. One initial anecdotal response that I'll say is that the many members of the Homeland Security committees are invested in defense contractors, and especially this includes Democrat Gary Peters of Michigan, who's the chair of the Senate Homeland Security, while he's invested in Raytheon, which is a pure play contractor that receives the vast majority of its revenue. There's also a significant amount of Senate appropriators, which is who own stock in defense companies. It includes Republican Shelley Moore Capito, who's also invested in pure play contractors, and Susan Collins, who owns up to $100,000 in Boeing and Raytheon. So there's the members of Congress who hold investments tend to have a relevant committee that in turn leads for Congress every year to allocate roughly half of the discretionary budget to the military, and of that, roughly half of the military budget to defense contractors. One really neat factoid that I was just looking at in preparation for this webinar was that to just pick one contractor, Lockheed Martin, a notable one, the largest federal defense contractor by revenue, and of course the top military contractor. Its revenue has grown since 2001 and the beginning of military operations in Afghanistan by some 60 billion ballpark dollars. Its annual defense revenue is, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere around high 60s, $70 billion annually. A jump of $60 billion is a company roughly the size of, say, agricultural giant Arthur Daniels Midland or the Walt Disney Company. These are enormous companies, and this is a company that the US Congress and the Department of Defense essentially created and bestowed to Lockheed Martin, while many, many members of Congress were personally receiving annual dividends over the last 20 years that total in the thousands of dollars, and investments that total in the hundreds of thousands of dollars in Lockheed Martin, which continues raking in defense cash.
Right. And someone, I see Robin in the chat, going off of that, said despite Lockheed Martin's track record for misconduct and cost overruns, like even despite all of this, does that remain true? And also, is there any discussion of the fact that they're just completely, they have basically no oversight over how this money is spent? Is that ever discussed in Congress?
Robin's question is right on. The flagship of Lockheed Martin's cost overruns is the very troubled F-35 fighter, which is costs have ballooned to far over $1 trillion. It's been approved for a plane that's only flown a percentage of its planned hours. Many members are invested in Lockheed Martin. I think the total is over $250,000 is currently held by members of Congress in Lockheed Martin stock. And in fact, many of the members who make the key decisions are continuing to cheer on Lockheed Martin even now. In the Sludge article, you'll see links to recent op-eds and tweets from Senator Blunt, who continues to cheer on Lockheed Martin, and with Republican senators call for continued investment in the kind of defense contractors, and as well as the technology for export that Lockheed Martin makes. Carley, in response to your question, there is pushback among progressives, especially in the House. Progressive Democrats last year did prompt one of the first recent votes against the continually ballooning Pentagon budget. That was in the summer, midsummer last year, in some ways the height of the pandemic during the summer last year. A proposed cut of the Pentagon budget by 10% that did not succeed in either the House or the Senate. But there was some initial pushback from these group of progressive Democrats who were outvoted by the majority of House Democrats who voted with Republicans. Even now, however, it's important to sort of catch up to this Congress and the current state of things, because it's budget season and people are looking ahead to next year. Currently, the Biden administration proposed a budget that's a slight increase over the last year of the Trump administration, and congressional authorizers have proposed a roughly $24 billion increase on top of that. So congressional appropriators, led by Democrats in both chambers, have done what's called a plus up on the military budget and are seeking to raise it above what the administration initially proposed. The full Congress will vote on that proposal about later this month, it's expected, but the majority of Democrats on key defense committees in each the House and the Senate are leading the charge to pad the defense budget with yet more tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, much of which will go to defense contractors like Raytheon and Northrop Grumman.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's so important to mention. The House Armed Services Committee just had this vote, and 14 Democrats joined their Republican colleagues in adding, like you said, another $25 billion on top of what President Biden asked for. And I think it's really important that we know the names of those 14 Democrats and we understand who those people are and why they're advocating to add so much money to the Pentagon budget. And we can post a link here. We tweeted about that when it happened, and we'll continue to hold them accountable. So I have a couple of other questions that relate a little bit to, some of the aspects of the article that you mentioned. Some people are asking, why aren't these facts discussed during campaign debates? Why isn't there more publicity around this, basically, is what people are asking. Mm-hmm. They're outraged, obviously. Mm-hmm.
I can sort of poke at some answers of parts of that, I think. Mm-hmm. The first is that the sprawling Pentagon budget is famously carved up into every congressional district, so that contractors source different parts and programs across all 438 congressional districts, which in turn creates the incentive for them to say they're defending jobs by ensuring that a given aircraft carrier or jet engine is not on, so to speak, on the table to be wound down and reduced out. Things, the kind of causes of military spending that have fueled everything from the last 2 decades, incredible spending on foreign military bases or military equipment that gets passed down to local police forces and others. So the first thing to keep in mind is that for members of Congress, some of the incentives are difficult sometimes to talk about the military budget if there's a contractor in their district that touts its manufacturing jobs. Of course, investing in other areas has been shown by research to be far more productive, not to mention less polluting than the tremendously polluting effects of the US military. There's another effect that I'll sort of briefly get at, which is that when people think about the military and how it has such a stranglehold over congressional appropriators, I'll encourage them to think about the revolving door. And if the revolving door, especially among the top military brass who move to defense contractors and are rewarded with $1 million board seats and executive positions, as well as other kinds of compensation that ensures that their stock portfolios are well padded after they leave the Department of Defense. There's a report from the watchdog group called POGO. It's called Brass Parachutes. Brass Parachutes is a memorable name, but I encourage folks to look it up, from a couple of years ago, that really identifies the revolving door as a key fact in how the military exerts its pressure over lawmakers in their offices on the Hill. If you think about something like the pharma industry that really, spends a ton of cash, it's got cash and throws it at elections. Or if you think about the big banks who have such a savvy lobbying operation and have contacts in every office for the financial industry, the defense industry, in addition to making campaign contributions to key defense officials, really is powered by its influence through the revolving door and through especially moving hundreds of high-level defense officials into contracting positions in these specialized industries that they know so well.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of extend that a little bit, I guess another question that I'm interested in, and I think some people are also hinting at in the comments when they're talking about how this is really just demonstrating it feels like the almost total corporate capture of our politicians. I'm wondering if you have a sense of how much money, like comparatively, how much money Congress people who are invested in military contractors receive. How does that compare to, say, like other corporate stocks that they might be invested in, right? Is, similar to just the almost total, corporate capture of the Pentagon budget. Is that this? Do you see that something similar happening across other budgets in the U.S. government?
Mm-hmm. The capture of the defense and the capture by the defense industry of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee is unique because, after all, these are the industries that get as we've been discussing, get the majority of their revenue from the annual defense bill and annual supplemental spendings. That these amounts, these contracts that total in the billions and tens of billions and add up into the hundreds of billions every year. Members of Congress and their stock portfolios, it's difficult information to get a comprehensive picture on. I can share, again, my screen again briefly, because our independent newsroom Sludge has tackled that question before in a September 2019 article that looked across different stock investments in business sectors. Here you can see that the lead was in financial stocks with a significant amount in communications and electronics. Defense was relatively modest among senators among these 5 sectors that we analyzed at the time. This article is also free to read online, so everyone can check more. But in comparison to, I'll jump down to the defense section. Well, here individuals can find this article's using the headline "Revealed: How U.S. Senators Invest in the Firms They're Supposed to Regulate." This was a joint project that Sludge published with The Guardian, and the different senators' investments across different companies can be found in the past here in this visualization. But for this year, the current military budget that's going to be voted on, folks can head over to the current article and see if their reps are listed here as a stockholder, and encourage their representatives ahead of the vote that's to come this year on the defense authorization bill to discuss how owning $130,000 worth of shares in Boeing and Raytheon affects their decision making.
Yep. Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. And we'll make sure everyone receives a copy of that as well. Sort of along those lines, when we're talking about the federal budget, someone asked in the chat, actually, they've heard that the Department of Defense is essentially unauditable. Does that have something to do with the fact that, people in Congress are not talking, or people in the media, et cetera, are not talking about this very obvious conflict of interest?
Well, I can encourage folks to check some of the recent reports of real Pentagon watchdogs, which includes the folks at the Project on Government Oversight, or POGO. Thanks to the folks who are throwing the name into the chat, as well. Also, the most recent Sludge article has quotes from from the advocacy group Win Without War, which has been active on issues of contacting, and of course probably CODEPINK folks might know more people to ask about some of that. I can refer. I'll throw it back on the screen. I can refer people to this past article in the Washington Post, 2016. The Pentagon buried evidence of $125 billion. That's $25 billion in inefficiency and waste a year for 5 years. So a total of $125 billion. This is a tremendous amount of public and taxpayer funding. That's if this had been reclaimed in 2016, that money would have been back in the public coffers by now. According to this Washington Post report, the Department of Defense buried the internal audit. That's an example of a recent difficulty in oversight of the Department of Defense, and especially also as well, anyone can find in recent news coverage, the House Democrats and Republicans are cheering on this $24 billion increase in the baseline Department of Defense budget, the trend lines are going in the direction of increased funding for the military, even after the situation in Afghanistan was far from the one that the military experts and the generals were portraying to the public officials who have the responsibility of asking them questions about the tremendously expensive and harmful war in Afghanistan and the war on terror in other places. So the one place that individuals can look is for the Defense Spending Reduction Caucus. That's a group that came together last year to start pushing for sort of cuts in the Pentagon budget, mostly progressive Democrats. And in the Senate, some of the names affiliated, of course, are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, Ed Markey as well. Over in the House, the Congressional Progressive Caucus leaders like Mark Pocan and Representative Jayapal and others have been calling for reduced military spending. They can look to their offices, to be able to ask questions of the Department of Defense about how taxpayer dollars are being allocated.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important to bring up. The Defense Spending Reduction Caucus was started by Representative Mark Pocan and Representative Barbara Lee, of course. And two pieces of legislation, actually, that I wanted to bring up in relation to that. First, Representative Mark Pocan just introduced something called the Covet Defense Act, which actually calls to reallocate 1% of 2021's Pentagon spending, which is about $9.6 billion, which is, ridiculous to hear. But just $9.6 billion to pay for global vaccine distribution, which by their accounts would increase global vaccine distribution by 30%. So just demonstrating not only the enormous Pentagon budget that we have, but also, right, look what would happen if we actually spent that money on something that's not US militarism, but instead, global solidarity, right? So I think that's a really good demonstration of that. And then also Barbara Lee, she in June of this year introduced House Resolution 476, which calls to cut the Pentagon budget by $350 billion and reallocate that spending to not only diplomacy efforts, but also social services. And her bill itself, if people read it, and we'll post a link to it, also details a lot of the enormous waste and fraud that has sort of trickled out of the Pentagon. And so I really encourage people to read that as well. So let's see, we have some other questions here. Another aspect of your article, David, you talk a little bit about divestments, and I wanted to touch on this as well. You highlight some prominent sitting congressmen who have reported divesting previously held stock, right, including Dianne Feinstein, who divested from Boeing, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess one question, and I think this gets at some of the other questions in the chat, which is like, what can we do about this? Is there any indication about why these representatives actually did divest? Was there pressure on them?
We're interested in finding out more about that, but that's something that I would encourage the folks listening to check some of the names that come through they come in the last quarter of the Sludge article, and to ask questions to their offices, especially if they're constituents, so they have a higher likelihood of receiving a response. The official forms often do not detail the reason, or even as much as one would expect, the specific date of a sale. The periodic transaction reports with information about this, the sale time are often not a complete data set, leaving investigators like our newsroom somewhat in the dark about a senator or representative office who suddenly no longer reports holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in Boeing stock, as Senator Feinstein does. Overall, there is a push among some reformers in Congress to ban Congress from owning and trading individual stocks. The main vehicle of legislation for that is called the Ban Conflicted Trading Act, but there's also a couple of other individual legislative items that are introduced this Congress, including another one that's bipartisan as well, just like the Ban Conflicted Trading Act is. Folks listening can ask their members of Congress if they're already a co-sponsor of the Ban Conflicted Trading Act, which is introduced in both the House and the Senate. It's got about a dozen co-sponsors in the House or so, I have to double check, but only 3 sponsors in the Senate, I believe, as of this time. Encourage the senators to sign on as co-sponsors of the Ban Conflicted Trading Act, which would move their investments into broadly held funds and would prevent senators like Roy Blunt from holding $250,000 in Lockheed stock while he cheers on the federal contracts in Lockheed for the F-35 plane that can't fly in rain.
Yeah, I think that's really important. That was going to be one of actually my next questions is like, what would if there are any current laws or bills that have been introduced in Congress that might prevent this sort of obvious conflict of interest, but also, in your mind, what would sort of an ideal law look like to outlaw these sort of investments? Would it just be as simple as saying no Congress people can invest in these companies? How would that actually work?
Mm-hmm. The Ban Conflicted Trading Act, which is supported in the Senate by Senator Sherrod Brown and Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon, and they're joined by another senator whose name I will double check and get back to and follow up on that, would require divestment to broadly held funds. Mutual fund investments would be okay. Other vehicles for reform along this line require blind trusts as an additional step, and I think that's a pretty strong option as well. But ethics experts that we've talked to have been generally that Sludge has talked to in our reporting have been generally supportive of the Ban Conflicted Trading Act approach as a solid way to prevent lawmakers from the appearance of or actual direct conflict of interest. And there have been, many attempts in the past at raising this, including one during President Obama's first term in office. That was called the Stock Act, and that's a law that's still on the books, but its enforcement was significantly weakened by a follow-up measure that was signed before President Obama's 2012 reelection. So the public does not have the degree of visibility that they need to, and on top of that, senators and representatives shouldn't be able to hold stock in individual companies when they're subject to so much private information.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think, it does just sort of come down right to that. And I think that's really important sort of note to end on. It looks like we've sort of addressed most of people's questions in the comments, unless there's anything else you see, David, that you wanted to touch on. I think that was everything, though. Any last things or last comments you wanted to make, David?
I'll end with sort of two other findings from our story that I think are neat, that are sort of remarkable examples of the conflicts at play here. There is something called the Joint Strike Fighter Caucus. That's a lot of reps from both sides of the aisle who are convinced that spending more money on the dysfunctional F-35 plane is more important than investing in climate, healthcare, education, et cetera, green energy, and more. They signed a letter last year calling for continued funding levels of the F-35, or else we're going to fall behind in capacity. At least 5 of the letter signers are personally invested in Lockheed Martin, the planes maker, to the tune of nearly $200,000. At that level, they're receiving thousands of dollars in dividends every year. And you can imagine that's a beneficial amount for these representatives, for them to be receiving every year from their stock. And there's one other example is that Representative Jerry Connolly of Leidos, he represents of Virginia. He represents the district in Northern Virginia where the defense contractor Leidos is based, and he's held up to $500,000 investment in the company while the company receives major defense contracts. That's an incredible example of the kind of thing that passes for normal on Capitol Hill, but that if it was a car dealership in your town, they'd have an ethics rule that would block that from happening. I encourage folks again to check our tables of the reps who own stock and ask questions of their office, raise it in letters to the editors, and please continue doing the activism that you're doing so that there can be wider public awareness of the immense spending on weapons and the way that the Pentagon budget jumps up every year when so many pressing needs in our schools and our environment.
Yeah, thank you, David. I think that's a sort of beautiful way to start closing us out here. And sort of on that note of what can we actually do about it, I did want to highlight quickly one of CODEPINK's tools that we actually use that people can actually take directly to their congressional representative and actually ask them, in this case, to stop taking campaign contributions from military contractors and the NRA. But using the knowledge from David's piece, you could also bring a request that they stop personally investing in those weapons manufacturers or military contractors broadly. So I'm going to just share my screen quickly. I want to show people what the pledge is and what it looks like, so everyone here is aware. So if you go to our website, it's very simple. It's just codepink.org/divestcongress, and we'll also post the link in the chat. And you'll see that there's a very simple tool to ask your congressperson to stop taking these campaign contributions from weapons manufacturers. I'll show you the form in just a second. We have a list of some of the representatives who have already taken that pledge. And also, all you have to do is fill in your information here, and it will automatically send an email to your representative. And we'll also contact you with information about following up with an in-person meeting with your representative to ask them to take this pledge. And I just opened the pledge for people. It's very simple. It's stop taking campaign contributions from the top 5 weapons makers. And this should be a very simple pledge for them to sign, especially because they approve the Pentagon budget every year, and it's such a clear conflict of interest. And just one last thing that I wanted to alert people to, especially because of what David just mentioned, right, is that we actually have to start going to our representatives, calling them out for the investments that they make and the campaign contributions that they actually take every year, because that's the only way that we're really going to start to cut the Pentagon budget. And actually, this Saturday is the 20th anniversary of 9/11. We're hosting a webinar to reflect on the lessons we should learn since 9/11 and the US war on terror. But the day after, on September 12th, CODEPINK is going to be in Washington, D.C. in person at the White House, launching a new campaign to cut the Pentagon for people, planet, peace, and future. And everyone here will receive a copy of this link so they can go here and start looking at some of the resources that we're gathering to really create a campaign to actually cut the Pentagon budget, right? We're ending the forever wars. It's ludicrous to think that we should continue to pour $750 to $760 billion every year into the Pentagon budget. So with that, I think that's everything that we wanted to chat about today. I want to thank you again, David, for joining us. This has been really helpful. I'm very excited that everyone here got a chance to hear more about your research, and we can make sure that people have your contact information as well, right?
Yes, please do. I welcome folks to drop me more of a note. I'd love to be in correspondence, and anyone can sign up for our free newsletter about our money and politics links at readsludge.com/newsletter. And we send a couple of times a month with our stories and more. So that's readsludge.com/newsletter.
Fantastic. And everyone here will get an email with all of that information. So with that, thank you so much, David and Shay. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and end the webinar since you're host whenever you have a chance. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for people in the chat. I see people are leaving. Thank you so much.